The top Chinese official now says Beijing has agreed to extend its tariff truce with the U.S.
A trade war defined by uncertainty. The trade talks between China and the United States have evolved into a complex game of strategy and power plays, where subtlety has taken precedence over confrontation. This was evident in July when a top Chinese official confirmed that Beijing had agreed to extend its tariff truce with the U.S. The meeting in Stockholm marked a critical point in the ongoing trade negotiations, where the Trump administration's economic pressure met Beijing's strategic patience. Donald Trump's approach to international trade was characterized by swift, aggressive moves aimed at securing favorable deals for the United States. With the European Union and Japan already agreeing to terms that aligned with his vision of bilateral pressure, U.S. officials were expecting a similar outcome when they sat down with Chinese negotiators. However, what they encountered was far from the typical pushback seen in previous trade talks. There were no dramatic walkouts or fiery threats, but instead, China responded with a calm, deliberate approach. It wasn't a retreat from negotiations, but rather a calculated move to buy time, avoiding a rush to sign agreements that would force them to restructure their economy on Washington's timeline. This strategy was evident in the way China handled the looming issue of tariffs on sanctioned Russian oil. U.S. negotiators made it clear that the president had the discretion to apply secondary tariffs, ranging from 0 to as high as 500% on Russian oil. China, however, made no effort to hide their stance. They responded firmly, stating that while they respected the sovereignty of the U.S., they were willing to absorb a 100% tariff if it came to that. This admission was strategic. China wasn't backing down, but they were sending a message that they were prepared to deal with the consequences without bending to the will of the U.S. U.S. officials came to the table with a list of demands that included curbing China's imports of sanctioned oil from Iran and Russia, committing to increased purchases of American goods, and addressing industrial overcapacity, especially in critical sectors like steel and electric vehicles, EVs. In return, the U.S. hinted at possibly scaling back or delaying the tariffs that had been steadily increasing. China, while agreeing to lift some restrictions on rare earth magnets, vital to U.S. defense and tech industries, offered few substantive concessions. They made it clear that they would offer a little to buy time, but their long-term strategic posture remained unchanged. The U.S. emphasized rebalancing trade and reshoring manufacturing, while China focused on minimizing disruption to its economy. Instead of acquiescing to the fast-paced demands of Washington, Beijing chose a slower, more methodical approach. The countries agreed to extend their tariff truce, but no final deal was reached. The extension would need Trump's personal approval, signaling that the process would continue at his discretion, but on Beijing's terms. China's tactic was one of subtle resistance. While Washington pushed for rapid progress, China played the long game, emphasizing procedural cooperation, future meetings, and the sharing of economic reports. This move allowed Beijing to delay any major confrontation and maintain its strategic advantage. Rather than simply being a passive participant in the talks, China used its strategic leverage to maintain diplomatic space and delay a full-scale escalation. At the heart of China's approach was its firm stance on rare earth supply. Despite easing some restrictions on exports to the U.S., Beijing's control over rare earth minerals remained an important bargaining chip. As of 2024, China held more than 90% of the world's rare earth refining capacity. This gave Beijing an edge over the U.S., as these materials are critical to defense and tech industries. China's position on oil imports was similarly firm. Instead of rejecting deals with sanctioned countries outright, Chinese officials acknowledged the trade and accepted the potential for penalties. This stance not only positioned China as a sovereign actor, willing to face consequences, but also minimized the likelihood of outright confrontation. China's message was clear. While they were willing to make some tactical concessions, they would not compromise their long-term economic and strategic interests. Beijing's approach of partial cooperation, strategic patience, and soft leverage allowed them to maintain their position while avoiding the kind of direct confrontation that the Trump administration had sought. The question that now looms is whether this more measured approach will ultimately serve China in the long run, especially as Trump's trade policies continue to shape global economic dynamics. The shifting landscape of global trade. As the August 1st tariff deadline loomed closer, the trade standoff between the U.S. and China seemed far from resolution. Instead of seeking an immediate agreement, Beijing opted to play the long game, strategically delaying the confrontation while strengthening its position in the global economic arena. This was a calculated response to the aggressive tactics employed by President Trump and his administration, who had made tariffs the centerpiece of their trade agenda. While the U.S. sought rapid results through the application of pressure, China approached the negotiations with a view toward minimizing disruption. This difference in approach was evident in the handling of the larger trade agenda, which was not limited to tariffs but also focused on structural economic changes, particularly in industrial overcapacity and the shifting global supply chains. For China, the fear of immediate economic reorganization and trade disruptions outweighed the potential benefits of a quick deal. Instead of caving to Washington's demands, China pursued a more subtle strategy of de-risking and strengthening its ties with other global partners. One of the more notable developments in this ongoing trade saga was the shift in Canadian trade policy. Amidst the uncertainty surrounding the U.S.'s unpredictable tariff strategies, Canada, led by Premier Doug Ford, quietly signaled its willingness to look eastward toward China for future trade opportunities. Ford's comments about potentially deepening trade relations with Beijing were not just a diplomatic maneuver, but a sign of frustration with the U.S.'s erratic trade policies. In fact, Ford suggested that if U.S. tariffs continued, Canada could turn to China for a more predictable and stable economic relationship. Canada's pivot toward China could have serious consequences for the U.S., especially in industries that rely heavily on stable trade with its northern neighbor. As of 2024, Canada accounted for a significant portion of the U.S.'s exports, purchasing $349 billion in goods, more than Japan, Germany, and the UK combined. Should Canada begin to shift a portion of this trade to China, it could deal a significant blow to U.S. manufacturers, particularly in sectors like automobiles, machinery, and agriculture. The impact would be felt most acutely in U.S. states like Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, where industries rely on Canadian trade. This shift in Canadian priorities highlights a growing trend in North America, one in which countries are beginning to rethink their trade relationships with the U.S. As trade disruptions continue, nations that once viewed the U.S. as their most reliable partner are exploring alternatives. Canada is not alone in this. Mexico and other Latin American countries are beginning to diversify their trade networks, seeking more stable relationships outside the U.S. In this shifting landscape, China stands out as a key player. Its growing influence in global trade, particularly in the developing world, gives it a distinct advantage as the U.S.'s traditional allies start to reconsider their loyalties. Beijing's efforts to establish alternative supply chains, bolster its position in multilateral forums, and expand trade through infrastructure investments like the Belt and Road Initiative all signal China's increasing influence in global economic affairs. The more China positions itself as a reliable and stable partner, the more likely countries like Canada, India, and Brazil will be to align with Beijing's economic vision, especially as the U.S.'s tariff policies push these nations away. Moreover, China's response to Trump's trade threats has been more diplomatic than expected. While Beijing's foreign ministry has made it clear that it opposes the use of tariffs as a tool for geopolitical leverage, it has avoided engaging in a full-scale retaliation. Instead, China has emphasized the importance of multilateral cooperation and focused on building new economic partnerships with countries that are not aligned with Washington. By strengthening ties with Europe, Latin America, and parts of Asia, China is positioning itself as the center of a new global economic network, one that could eventually challenge the U.S.'s long-standing dominance. Trump's approach, while aggressive and seemingly effective in some areas, may have backfired by alienating many of the U.S.'s traditional allies. Countries like India, Brazil, and South Africa, who are key members of the BRICS group, have been vocal about their discomfort with Trump's tariffs and the shifting global dynamics. While these nations may not fully abandon the U.S., their increasing engagement with China and their push for alternative economic systems, such as the use of local currencies and non-dollar trade agreements, suggest a shift away from Washington's influence. China, meanwhile, has been able to present itself as the voice of reason, advocating for a multilateral, development-focused approach to trade that stands in contrast to the U.S.'s more unilateral tactics. As China continues to expand its influence, It remains to be seen how the U.S. will respond. Trump's tariffs were initially designed to protect American workers and bring fairness to global trade, but they have instead created a volatile environment that threatens to fracture key relationships and push countries into China's orbit. The challenge for the U.S. will be to recalibrate its trade policies in a way that restores stability without further isolating itself from the rest of the world. A test of global economic power. The unfolding trade dispute between the U.S. and China has reached a critical juncture. As President Trump's tariffs have pushed nations to reevaluate their economic strategies, Beijing's carefully orchestrated diplomatic stance has presented an intriguing challenge to U.S. leadership in global trade. While the U.S. has used its tariffs to apply pressure, China has responded with a more subtle form of leverage, positioning itself as the reliable partner in an increasingly unpredictable global economy. This shift could fundamentally alter the balance of power in international trade for years to come. Trump's administration has relied heavily on tariffs as a central tool in its strategy to reshape global trade. By imposing tariffs on key allies and rivals alike, the White House aimed to force trade deals that benefit the U.S. economy. However, as the tariffs have piled up, so too has the uncertainty surrounding their ultimate effectiveness. The move to impose additional tariffs on countries that align with the BRICS group, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, only adds another layer of complexity to an already fraught trade environment. Rather than bowing to pressure, many of these nations have chosen to embrace China's more measured and cooperative approach, further isolating the U.S. China's strategy during these tumultuous trade negotiations has been marked by a long-term vision. Rather than retreating or retaliating in kind, Beijing has emphasized the importance of patience, diplomacy, and the cultivation of strong international alliances. Through projects like the Belt and Road Initiative, China is working to strengthen its influence in developing countries and create a more diversified global trade network that doesn't rely on the dollar or the Western-dominated financial system. This shift is not just economic, it's geopolitical, and it signals China's readiness to assert itself as the dominant force in global trade. What's more, China has carefully reframed the BRICS platform, positioning it as an inclusive, cooperative economic bloc rather than a counterbalance to the U.S. As countries like India and Brazil increase their trade with China, Beijing's appeal as a trade partner grows. This has far-reaching implications for the U.S., which has long sought to maintain its dominance in global markets. If countries that once leaned heavily on American trade begin to shift their allegiances, the U.S. could find itself at a disadvantage, facing a world where economic alliances no longer revolve around Washington's priorities. This strategic positioning is further reflected in China's diplomatic approach. Instead of engaging in retaliatory tariff wars, Beijing has focused on forging partnerships with European nations and expanding its influence in global financial institutions. Through investments in green energy, infrastructure projects in Europe, and multilateral cooperation with countries like Germany and France, China is positioning itself as the global leader in sustainable development and economic cooperation. These efforts are strengthening its diplomatic clout, not just economically but politically as well, as it pushes for a multipolar world order that allows for greater sovereignty for emerging economies. For the U.S., the path forward is far from clear. The immediate future of the U.S.-China trade dispute hinges on whether the tariff truce will hold past the August 1st deadline. As if Trump decides to impose new tariffs on China or countries aligned with the BRICS group, the economic consequences could be profound. U.S. manufacturers, already reeling from the uncertainty caused by the previous rounds of tariffs, would face additional pressure as their supply chains are further disrupted. Companies that rely on exports to China could see their margins squeezed, while American consumers may face higher prices for goods previously sourced from overseas. But the impact of Trump's tariffs may extend beyond just economics. As countries like Canada and Brazil begin to shift their trade relationships toward China, the U.S. risks losing its strategic influence in the Western Hemisphere. The economic power that the U.S. once wielded as the largest consumer market in the world is now being challenged by China's growing dominance in trade, technology, and investment. The question that remains is whether Trump's trade policies, designed to strengthen the U.S., have instead created a world where America is increasingly isolated, forcing countries to reconsider their alliances. The broader implication is that this trade war is not just about economic numbers or tariffs. It's about two competing worldviews. Trump's America First policy relies on coercive power, leveraging tariffs and trade wars to force changes in the global economic system. In contrast, China's approach emphasizes stability, cooperation, and long-term economic partnerships. While Trump seeks to isolate China and punish countries that align with it, Beijing is focused on expanding its reach through strategic investments and diplomatic relationships. In the end, the U.S. may find that its aggressive stance is not enough to keep China in check. The rising power of the BRICS nations, combined with China's growing economic influence, signals a shift in global trade dynamics. For now, China remains focused on protecting its sovereignty, refusing to succumb to the pressures of the U.S., while continuing to build a network of trade partnerships that might one day rival America's global influence. The future of U.S.-China relations may hinge on more than just tariffs. It will depend on how the world adapts to the new economic order. As Beijing's patience, diplomacy, and long-term strategic vision continue to reshape the trade landscape, the U.S. will need to rethink its approach if it hopes to maintain its role as the world's economic leader. Whether this trade conflict turns into a broader geopolitical battle remains to be seen. But one thing is clear: the global order is changing, and the U.S. must decide how it will navigate this new world.